It's a remarkable year that you've had. In the context of the British media, you've gone from being more or less unknown to being the Pulitzer Prize winner responsible for probably the biggest story of a decade in the context of celebrity reporting and, of course, the launch of the Me Too movement. But I'm going to begin just by highlighting the three areas that we're not going to talk about on the grounds, perfectly reasonably, that you're sick to death of talking about them and they're not particularly fruitful. You're estranged from your father, Woody Allen, on the perfectly reasonable grounds that he's now also your brother-in-law. Your paternity is your business and nobody else's, and similarly your love life. But the fact that you stipulate that you don't want to talk about those things speaks of a...
I certainly haven't stipulated that.
Oh, have you not?
No.
Well, I'm happy to observe this because I'm not interested.
I appreciate the preemptive gesture of wanting to focus on
the work,
the reporting, and the foreign policy.
And before that, on the background that created the journalist that you've become, because it seems to me when you speak of being inculcated with your mother, Mia Farrow's Catholic schoolgirl worldview, this altruism that was not... That was your reality. You were born into a family with myriad siblings, many of whom had severely disadvantaged backgrounds. And there's a sense in everything you've done since that you have a deep desire to help.
I hope that I can be a small part of the solution. And that does, I think, flow from having grown up in a family where the world's problems were very much at my doorstep because my siblings were adopted from all over the world with backgrounds of very difficult disability and abuse.
I'm adopted. And when I've read you talk about your siblings, you seem to have... How can I put this? You don't have a very high regard for biology. Your love for your siblings doesn't seem to be in any way informed or diminished by whether or not there's a blood link. Is that fair?
I'm happy to hear that comes through because that is absolutely my worldview. And, you know, the ethical responsibilities of family and the love that holds a family together has nothing to do with biology and blood ties.
When did you realize that your childhood was a little extraordinary?
I mean, I think it was fairly apparent from the beginning.
But you need a point of reference, don't you? You need to be able to compare it to...
Well, you know, I was growing up in predominantly in a small town in New England where we were the only family of color. We were every minority under one roof. You know, I never saw a black person, an Asian person, other than my own siblings in that community. So... you know, we always looked different, and people sort of were puzzled and said, "Oh, what's this about?"
Self-consciousness ever on your part? Did you ever sort of think, I wish we looked like all the other families?
Plenty of self-consciousness, but not about that. I was always very proud of the family.
Yes?
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
You know, I imagine my mother did a tremendous job as a very strong single working mother in, you know, always raising us from square one with a certain set of values about equality and about the importance of addressing problems where you see them. And there was never any kind of, you know, regret about the kind of family I had or shame or stigma. You know, I had several cases where my black siblings in particular would get called, you know, the N-word in school by, you know, I think less sort of malicious people and more just kids trying on epithets for size. And, you know, it would be interesting to see how different families dealt with that in different ways. There was one prominent Broadway performer who I won't name to spare her son, who was, I think, like 7 or 8 when this happened, but who her son had, you know, used this word about one of my siblings, and, you know, she came over with like pastries and, you know, tearful apologies, and you know, obviously that kid was set straight. But so I saw the ways in which you know, race is such a complicated issue in America, and in which I guess in the eyes of some, this kind of family I had could be a source of stigma, but I never internalized that for a second. I always viewed it as a really wonderful, positive thing to fly a flag about.
Did you ever get into fights?
I wasn't really a scrapper in that way. I mean, it's funny, people see in my work that I'm quite confrontational and unafraid of a fight, but yes. That's not really my manner interpersonally. And I actually, I have to tangle in this line of work with some very aggressive people and people who use, bullying as a tactic and kind of sort of intimidation and try to get you on the wrong foot and destabilize you. And, I know how to deal with that, but it's definitely not my manner. And I actually, I don't enjoy that kind of sparring as some people do.
I wondered.
I find it inefficient. I find it counterproductive.
Yes. I wondered how we were going to broach the subject of your sort of prodigal status as a child, because again, it's something that you're probably a little bored of talking about, but for a British audience in particular, some of the simplest statistics are staggering. And it occurs to me as you answer that question that you answered as if there was no distinction between Ronan the child and Ronan the adult. When I asked if you got into fights, I kind of had an image of a kid getting into scrapes, whereas the answer you gave, and I suspect it did apply to Ronan the child as much as it applies to Ronan the adult, was very measured and almost utilitarian. You didn't get into fights because they wouldn't have achieved anything.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think I probably had more temper than I have now as a kid. I think that is one of the things that, developed in a positive direction over time. But I was never a big fighter. I would say any flare-ups of that were very occasional. You're right. It's a really interesting and insightful way of framing things to talk about how sharp a distinction any of us draws between our childhood selves and our present-day selves. I don't really draw a sharp dividing line. It feels to me much more like I've certainly evolved, and I'm sure I was insufferably annoying as a kid, and I hope that while I'm probably still somewhat annoying as an adult, I've sanded the edges off a little. But I don't reflect on that period of my life like I'm looking back on a different person. I think probably because I had fairly adult responsibilities from a fairly young age, as you alluded to.
Yes, this is enrolling at college before,
it all feels
hitting
quite
puberty.
Recent to me.
You were 11 years old when you enrolled at college,
right.
Which is
university
here.
At 11 and
11 years old.
Yeah, and then I got into law school, which in the States is a 3-year graduate degree at 15 or 16, but I deferred to work for a couple of years, and none of this seemed particularly extraordinary in the context of growing up with, again, a working single mom who had to enter the workforce as a teenager. She was on the soaps because that was the family business and she needed to support the family. So there was always this kind of attitude of you go out and you do the hard work, and a lot of people do it earlier rather than later.
How did it affect you socially? I mean, you have to kind of adopt a mature demeanor. I suspect that came very naturally to you. But you can't really make friends with 19-year-olds when you're 11, can you? Or can you?
I mean, you'll have to be the judge of how socially dysfunctional I am,
I'm not talking about now. I'm talking about back at college, whether you were lonely or not.
I picked small idiosyncratic schools. Yale Law School is very small, fraction of the size of each Harvard law class. And even when I went and did a Rhodes Scholarship out here at Oxford, these were, first of all, very rarefied opportunities, and I don't take it for granted at all. Extraordinary groups of people to be involved when, the Rhodes or Yale Law is the same way. Every classmate is a paraplegic ballerina astrophysicist, and they just blow you away, and it keeps you humble. But because of those smaller settings, I think I was able to be in environments that were actually quite nurturing. And when there was an age gap, people were like, big siblings. And
were they?
Yeah,
people looked out for you. Do you have friends from? Do you have friends from Bard?
I do. I have close friends from the college years, and then the timing worked out quite nicely in that because I deferred for a couple of years and worked. When I started law school, I was sort of at exactly the age when I should have been an undergrad at Yale, and I was able to have both groups of friends, the somewhat older law school friends, and then also the undergrad friends who were in my age group.
So if I'd asked you at 11 what you wanted to be when you grew up, what would you have said?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I was passionate about science as a kid. I read voraciously and read a lot of, Stephen Hawking and Carl Sagan, and, first was very much into the idea of astrophysics and sort of the fundamental questions about the origins of the universe, and then developed, I think, a more tangible love of like turning over stones and looking at worms. And I read about Gerald Durrell and the work of naturalists, and loved that. And I think when I got to college, it was really just finding that it's much harder to make a significant impact in the space of naturalism these days. Not that there aren't great people working in that space, but
that's quite an interesting admission.
Well, just that I felt like if I wanted to make a real scientific stride, it's probably not going to be in It's probably not going to be in animal behavioral studies, I concluded. And as I'm saying it aloud, I'm realizing, of course, that isn't fundamentally the case. We could have huge revelations there. But the kind of the life-saving work that scientists are doing are not necessarily as much in that space. And so I became a biology major and, was in pre-med for a while. And then, frankly, I was just so bad at organic chemistry that I abandoned ship. And like so many lawyers, I'm a lawyer created by my inadequacy as a scientist.
You must have got sick of Doogie Howser jokes when you were in pre-med.
A little bit.
Yeah, so we won't make any. Don't worry.
I just wasn't, if I had been just a hair more brilliant, maybe I would have lived out the Doogie Howser narrative.
It's interesting and very honest to talk about impact being a consideration at such a young age, so much so that it would steer you away from one course and perhaps towards another one.
It was all not just an ancillary consideration. It was really the fundamental philosophy that I was raised with, for better or worse. I have to figure out my feelings about this as I eventually raise my own kids. I was not raised in a family where the number one goal was presented as happiness. It was always the worldview that I was given that, happiness is important, but much more important is making the world a better place in whatever way you can. And, the kind of role models that were held up in my childhood and, whose life works I read about and internalized were people doing kind of selfless humanitarian work and of a level that I, have not lived up to and probably will never because I'm not that selfless. But those were sort of the ideals that I was given.
Which is quite an odd backdrop for a journalist these days.
Is it? Look, journalism is
these days.
Maybe so. In my mind, journalism is absolutely in the space of public service. It's, it's the only constitutionally protected profession in the United States. The power of the free press to hold the powerful accountable is tremendous and indispensable. So it was always, an endeavor that flowed from wanting and not always succeeding in making the world a little bit better and the conversation a little bit truer and richer.
And you get to look under stones, albeit figuratively rather than
that's right.
Literally.
I think you're correct to draw that link.
So Richard Holbrooke, who of course became your mentor and special envoy to Afghanistan and Pakistan, he was right when he described you as having a great sense of destiny.
Well, destiny is something else, though, right? Because destiny is the conviction that you're going to be in the history books in some way, which I think that he had about himself.
What else does impact mean?
Well, I think impact is often silent and low profile.
So you don't necessarily need to be lauded for what you're doing.
Yeah, I think, look, I'm grateful anytime I am because I'm also under plenty of fire and I've, taken my beatings in the press. I've been, mercilessly, essentially hazed publicly in various acts of my career. And, I'm grateful for any commendations and support for the work I'm doing. But when I think of impact, that's not what I'm talking about. I think the, Doctors Without Borders, medical professional in a refugee camp who you never hear about, but I've, seen these kinds of people in my work and my travels. Like that's someone who's saving lives, right? So that's it becomes actually a very kind of like a utilitarian, almost a numbers game of like how many people are you helping and how much. Yes. And I'm not really in that space where it's about, how many people can I tangibly actually save. But I do hope that, the journalism I do lends some strength to people and elevates some voices that need elevating.
So when did that light come on? When did the journalistic ambition first manifest itself?
I grew up around stories
Yes.
and loving classic cinema. My grandmother was Maureen O'Sullivan, Jane in the Tarzan movies, one of the first American Irish movie stars.
Also a fierce intellect,
Yeah.
which people possibly didn't realise at the time.
She was brilliant and a great raconteuse. She knew her way around a damn good story, and she actually was briefly what was called at the time a Today girl, a female anchor on the Today Show. And obviously I was then on that set decades later anchoring. And she is a minor footnote in journalistic history because her, I think, quite prompt dismissal from that job paved the way for Barbara Walters to take that job. And as I recall, the fundamental problem with my grandmother as a news anchor was that she was such a good storyteller about herself and not at all interested in reading up on the news.
Charming.
And that she was immensely charming and funny. And that doesn't surprise me to hear that was the demise of her TV anchoring career.
But that was your lodestar, was it? Knowing that your grandmother had done it, and then this culture of
not at all.
storytelling?
It was. I just give that as an example of I grew up watching her, but also films in general from the 30s and 40s, and the works of great directors. I grew up on Ingmar Bergman and Buñuel movies and Kurosawa movies and Hitchcock and would read scripts, growing up. Like I always, in recent years, have always just delighted in like devouring whatever the scripts on the Blacklist are. And, very often.
What's the Blacklist?
So the Blacklist is an organization in Hollywood that they sort of pick the best unproduced scripts every year. So that's an inside baseball Hollywood thing, but it's a huge commendation if you're writing a script on spec and it's a blacklist script.
Yes.
And there's some great films that get made out of those scripts eventually, and then sometimes they never get made, or sometimes it's an incredible script and then it gets made into a mediocre movie.
Yes,
but
I'm sure.
I also grew up loving fiction, as a reader. And one of my goals with War on Peace was to make sure it read like a novel, that it was vital and character driven, and had a lot of density of observational detail that gives you a sense of time and place.
You skipped the bit in between the fiction and the reportage. Where your love of stories made you want to be someone who told stories that are true.
Well, I think therefore when I was in situations like, in refugee camps in Darfur and talking to women who were survivors of rape as a weapon of war.
Would you usually be with your mum when you do this, or did you do it on your own steam as well?
I got to see her advocacy early on, and then I also ended up, partly because of that, having opportunities to do my own advocacy, and was immensely grateful for and informed by that. And when listening to those stories, especially the ones from survivors of sexual violence in those war zones, it became very apparent that there wasn't enough reporting going on, and indeed in some of these places that the press couldn't get in sufficient numbers. I mean, there were obviously fantastic beat reporters in all of these places, but there were some occasions where I was seeing things that not enough reporters could see. And so, I think it was immediately apparent to me that telling stories about that was a powerful way to maybe instigate change for the better, or at least more understanding. And I began submitting op-eds to, the big American newspapers and started getting stuff printed.
While working in foreign policy as well as visiting refugees, because you came under Richard Holbrooke's wing at about the age of 21, which in normal years is about 40, but in Ronan Farrow years is 21.
Yeah, so by that time I had already been to law school. I had already, written extensively for some years, and these were just rinky-dink, small-time op-eds, but I did develop relationships with those op-ed
with
pages.
A foreign policy specialism.
Foreign policy and human rights, and heavily reported, a lot of them with a lot of detail from on the ground in these places I was. And I did develop, ongoing relationships with publications where, there would be stretches of several months where I'd be doing a column a month for the Wall Street Journal. I did some stuff for the Washington Post, the LA Times. And it's funny because thinking back on that, the landscape has changed even since then, media-wise. Those op-ed pages don't command the sort of exclusive force of influence that they did even 10 years ago. There's now so many more platforms online for people to write in. But at the time, it was I was very grateful that I didn't have connections to any of those newspapers. And truly, I think op-eds were, and to an extent still are, a rare kind of meritocratic way in that, like,
you stand and fall by what you've written.
You're looking at their inbox full of pitches every day, and they'll run, an op-ed from a no-name college student with a vivid and important experience. They'll run an op-ed from a wonky policy expert. They'll run an op-ed for a celebrity or not. So it was an interesting kind of level playing field where, it was may the best man win, and I was writing. Okay. Well, yeah, I was writing about stuff that I thought was important, and I was grateful to run into editors who then said, "Okay, we'll run this."
Did you get scared pitching? Did you fear rejection because you haven't had much in your life?
Oh, that's absolutely not true. I think I've failed as publicly and spectacularly as people can, and of course, everyone fears rejection. I fear rejection terribly, but you can't let that stop you. You have to keep hammering away at things that matter.
You're referring to your TV show being axed mostly, or
yeah, I mean, look, there's also all the jobs, of course, that I haven't gotten and that I've fought for, and all the near misses.
What kind of things have you?
Well, you'll have to wait for the memoir for that. But yeah, no, I've been rejected all the time and criticized, very, very harshly. And I don't think, mercifully, I guess, those parts of one's biography don't stick as much as you think or fear that they will at the time.
Yes. Especially as we've got the Atlantic between us, so we've really
right. So in England, they just you get the successes.
The star is at its highest.
Thank God, I love this filtered version of me. But yeah, no, I've had my share of being savaged publicly as well, and I think it's it's one reason why people have sort of grudgingly just focused on the work, and I think acknowledged the importance of these women's stories without me creating any noise, because I think in the American media, they know that I've been sort of put through my paces and sufficiently beaten up that they can lay off a little bit. Not that I don't get plenty of attacks still, but...
How thick is your skin, honestly?
That's a great question that I'm probably not equipped with sufficient perspective to answer, honestly. I would hope that I can tolerate a lot now, having been through a lot of withering public criticism and mocking. I guess it's not so much about having a thick skin in the sense that you don't care or are unaffected by it, which, I'm too insecure to ever probably get to that point. But you have to have a thick skin in the sense that, you can feel the hurt of that kind of public criticism and still carry on with your work. And the benefit of doing work that is not really about you and matters for the sake of other people who are doing a tough thing is, you don't have that much time or space to keep thinking about yourself.
No. You don't give yourself much time and space to think about yourself.
No, you can't. I mean, look, maybe...
Well, you say you can't. You can. You choose not to.
Yeah, no, I suppose I do choose not to. And maybe, look, it would take a better shrink than I am to fully psychologize. Like, is my, breakneck schedule of, trying to turn these stories around and writing these books.
Because you were on the phone when you came here. You've got something bubbling away, clearly. There's myriad unfinished projects I've picked up from other interviews that you did, and you routinely put in 18, 19-hour days. You missed one of your sister's weddings during the Weinstein. Did she forgive you for that?
She was just texting me, and she's lovely, and I am so grateful that she seems to have forgiven me for that. I'll keep making that up to her over the years. I mean, look, as I said, it would take some outside perspective to judge whether some of that is deliberately trying to eliminate the space to contemplate those issues of self-consciousness too deeply. But in general, I think, I try to be self-reflective about my own flaws and foibles and to address them without allowing myself to get mired in the terrible echo chamber of public criticism, and particularly social media era public criticism.
Yes, it's a very different age.
I wrote a cover story for an American magazine called W Magazine about Miley Cyrus a few years ago, who I thought was a fascinating character. This was sort of at the peak of her breakout moment.
She was kind of a canary down the coal mine for the zeitgeist, wasn't she?
Yeah, a little bit. And was always sort of an interesting and dynamic artist, more so than the platforms she had early on allowed. And a very forthright motor mouth of a character. We spent hours and hours together, and she was high as a kite and let loose and said a lot of colorful things. But she probably more than most of us had to grapple with this incredible public pressure and, the combination of adulation and ridicule and felt, I think, at that time very embattled. It was right when she was getting all this criticism about this MTV award ceremony where she had been sort of particularly salacious and people were shocked and clutching their pearls. And, she described withdrawing to her sort of, walled mansion in the Hollywood Hills and, saying like, people ask me on dates and they want to go out and go to the movies with me. And, why would I ever want to go out? Like, I have a chef here. I have a TV here. Like, I don't want to leave. There's paparazzi everywhere. I get chased by them. And it was her against the world to an extent. But one of the insights, that I gained from that, because it was sort of a heightened version of what I'd dealt with, is we both talked about the distorting and traumatic influence of like reading about yourself online, and the fact that everyone who I guess would have been relegated to ranting drunkenly at a bar now has a Twitter account means every time you turn that thing on, there's the full range of like, I love you, I want to marry you, and also, which is of course unearned and dangerous to internalize, and that creates monsters, and equally I hate you, get cancer and die in a fire, and then the more serious death threats that are like, oh, actually this is a little scary.
Phone this one in.
And you if you expose yourself to that in full force all day, every day, I think it really does kind of destroy your psyche. And there's no room for anything but thinking about yourself and your reputation and all these things that ultimately are noise that I think can impede your ability to do work that matters. And it's so funny to be quoting Miley Cyrus, like, a source of sage wisdom. But even,
not necessarily
at that young age, she did say, like, I have enforced a ban on looking at Twitter or Googling for myself. I have turned off the Google alerts. Yes. I have, strenuously avoided for her mental health. And, clearly that was necessary for her to, do her art in a way that was clear-minded.
When did you last do nothing for several hours consecutively?
And look, I am fearful of the answer because obviously it's necessary for all of our mental health to do nothing for a few hours now and then. I did get a good night's sleep on the red eye over. I took a sleeping pill. I slept through a whole flight and I was really proud. But then they did have cameras at Heathrow for my first TV performance right after.
I didn't mean sleeping. I didn't mean sleeping.
Just sitting and contemplating and doing nothing. I had a lovely dinner with a source a couple of nights ago. No, it doesn't count. No. Yeah, the answer is it's been a while.
Okay, yeah. And that may be why the work has ended up being so important.
I'm acutely aware of the compromises and the ways in which it's dangerous to not have space for a well-rounded existence. And I do try to counterbalance the work when I can, but this is a particularly
You're on a roll.
Densely populated window. I had an experience recently that really hit me hard, where I learned that a friend from law school had died tragically of ovarian cancer, and I hadn't even known that she had been fighting this. It came on quite suddenly, and she was in a fairly large category for me of friends that I cared about very much, but hadn't been good at keeping up with. And she was a remarkable and generous person who had given up a profitable legal career to do good works at a legal clinic. And I was hit hard by both the loss, but also the realization that thank God she died surrounded by family and friends, and it does throw into relief these decisions we make early on and how they echo in all of our years. And I certainly know plenty of people who have been absent parents and bad friends and lay down to die at the end of it. I think quite lonely and bereft of something really important. So it's a balancing act, and I am very fortunate to have wonderfully accommodating friends and family around me that I talk to constantly, and I don't feel alone in it. But yeah, it's a busy time.
It is a very busy time. Let's begin then with the pitch meeting at NBC, where you proposed a multi-part series looking at the sinister underbelly of Hollywood, I think, and they said no.
No, that's not correct. They said yes to that, and that got greenlit. And I worked for several months. And I should warn you, I'm only going to give you the broad strokes on this because there's more to come on that story down the line. And I still think we're in a window where it's important to focus on the underlying allegations, which clearly, with these latest reports, including ones I've been involved in, are still coming to the fore. But yes, the behind-the-scenes progression was that I had retained a green light on this series, and a lot of the edges got sanded off, and some of the tougher stories that were supposed to be in there about rape, pedophilia, and race in Hollywood got killed, but there was still a green light on a story on harassment and casting couch culture. And it was in the course of reporting that story that I began to get leads about the Weinstein allegations and interview people on the record, and then very rapidly obtained this mythical NYPD sting tape, which included a pretty direct confession from him that he had assaulted someone. And was explosive and went everywhere in the world.
The Italian one.
Exactly right.
That's how.
So there was a lot of evidence and, a lot of testimonials, and eventually all of the sources from within the Weinstein Company and Miramax who were quoted in the New Yorker story that ultimately ran. Many of them went on camera, and it began to coalesce quite fast.
And it went into the New Yorker because NBC didn't give you
that's right.
full broadcast, and this is where you're going to confine yourself to broad brushstrokes because
indeed,
that's absolutely fine. It's your scoop.
Thank you.
Do you think you would have got these people to talk to you in quite the way they did had you not yourself been a form of Hollywood royalty?
You'd have to ask them that.
Well, I will if I get the chance, but I'm just asking what you think.
Yeah, I don't know. I know
it's an astonishing level of access, and it is.
I think that. Look, when you're recounting the most difficult experience of a lifetime and it's so re-traumatizing to talk about it, I don't think there's a lot of confidence gained by knowing that, someone has family members in the industry. I think that's, neither a cost nor a benefit.
No.
I do think that the fact that I had been an outspoken reporter on sexual assault issues and, had come forward and supported my sister in her allegations against Woody Allen after a very careful review of those facts, people understood that I was someone who would put my money where my mouth was, if you will, and would have some degree of sensitivity about just how hard this was for them.
And yet you're adamant that you're not an activist, you're a reporter. I completely understand that distinction, but I'm not sure it's quite as clear as you've sometimes suggested.
Yes, I don't
care.
claim.
I mean, anyone would care.
Yeah, but I don't claim that it's a completely bright line between those two roles. I do think that there's an important distinction there.
Yes.
My objective in telling a story, like the Eric Schneiderman story this week, or even like War on Peace, which is quite a bit more polemical, is not necessarily to affect policy change in a direct, immediate sense. It's to expose hard truths that hopefully can catalyze that conversation so others can affect policy change. And I do think that that's a meaningful distinction. I don't go into an investigation like this with a plotted out outcome or a specific hope necessarily. And, to give you an example, if these allegations against Eric Schneiderman had not checked out to the extraordinary extent that they did, you never would have been reading about it today.
Yes. For people who don't know, this is the attorney, what's the official title?
The New York Attorney General.
The New York Attorney General had been a prominent advocate of the Me Too movement, as it were, and has now stepped down.
And my colleague Jane Mayer at the New Yorker and I wrote this story about these horrific allegations of domestic violence and abuse against him. And in each of these cases, I would only be too happy to have the facts tell me that there's, a different side of the story or, people have got it wrong.
Yes.
I'm guided by the facts and I interrogate the facts skeptically.
Always skeptical.
Always.
So you don't, because we had an interesting, and we're only halfway through the interview, and I promise you that we'll devote a proper amount of time to the new work, because I'm conscious that that's why you're in Britain, and it couldn't really be more timely with the Iran announcement today. But I just want to ask you a couple more questions about this. Well, partly actually, if we're honest, because the profile that this book will enjoy is going to be built partly upon the success of your other journalism, albeit in a completely different field. The Mossad stuff, the former Mossad agents that Weinstein would routinely employ to quell some of these stories, to keep them. You were moving into really scary territory when you were doing this investigation.
Yes. I mean, one of the things that I am very proud that we exposed in that series of New Yorker stories about Harvey Weinstein was that he, through his very powerful, prominent, Democratic attorney, David Boies, hired, muscle, essentially, these combat-ready former Israeli intelligence agents who assumed false identities and built front companies and went after women with allegations and reporters.
When did you first begin to grasp the sheer scale of it, rather than it just being, I don't know quite what the adjective would be, but I suppose expectable, maybe, scandal, as opposed to being utterly almost
bonkers?
Yeah, bonkers. That's exactly the word.
I think the formal term may be bonkers. I mean, it really did feel at times like living in a movie, and maybe that's a reflection of, that scenario being created by, a producer who thought on some level he was living in a movie. I mean, it's an extraordinary step to take to hire these kinds of characters to do this kind of intrusive human intelligence work.
Roman, almost, in its scope, the kind of in terms of the debauchery coupled with
or
the
Greek.
institution.
Take your pick.
Exactly that. And when did you know that you'd got over the hump, as it were? When did you know that you'd got the story and you would be able to go to presses with it?
I knew that I had the story very early last year, by the moment I heard that recording, the moment I had, a sufficient number of conversations with women with allegations that were too uncannily similar and were produced independently. And I think it was apparent to every journalist who looked at it, even in those early months, that this was a massive story backed by really explosive evidence.
And I sense that in your mind, we possibly haven't even seen the half of it yet.
I think that's right. I think that the behind-the-scenes story of why it didn't run then is very much tied into the systems that you're asking about, and the campaigns of intimidation, and these individuals digging up blackmail material, and all of these colorful and elaborate lengths that not just Harvey Weinstein, but powerful people in general can go to warp and distort systems of justice and orderly process.
What are your feelings towards Weinstein personally now? Because your social circles must have crossed occasionally.
Yeah, and only in a really positive way. I had sort of cocktail party level interactions with him, and felt totally neutral on him, or sort of had the relatively fond perception that people did that he was this colorful, maybe ill-tempered, but creatively genius,
which is why
Hollywood character.
These people get forgiven, isn't it? Because of the content, the perception of genius.
And I'd point out that the presence of these systems commanded by powerful people to suppress and intimidate more vulnerable people is a theme that runs through all of this reporting.
Yes.
Through the Weinstein story and the Eric Schneiderman story, where women are accusing him of using the power of his office to intimidate them, and through the story I just broke about those same Black Cube agents, these undercover operatives, in some cases using the very same front companies that they came after me using, going after proponents of the Iran deal.
Yes.
And in the testimonials of whistleblowers in War on Peace. These are all stories about sometimes overlapping forms of the abuse of power.
Yes, there's no morality, is there? That perhaps is the myth of ordinary people, that they presume that there's a moral compass in place even in the highest corridors of power. But in fact, we seem to be living in an era, and that's why the reference to Rome and ancient Greece maybe was pertinent. We seem to be living in an era where the more power you have, the more excused you are from conventional morality.
I get asked a lot, what surprises me most in different contexts. What surprises me most about this story, about that story? Yeah. And I think that sometimes it's not a fully thought out question. It's very open-ended.
Yes.
But in fact, I would say one of the consistent surprises is exactly what you alluded to. The sheer lack of a moral core and backbone guiding people in corridors of power, as you say. You said earlier that sort of ethical journalism is not as present as we'd like. You made some allusion to, not everyone has that attitude about journalism as an act of public service with, tied to profoundly important moral mandates.
Yes, exactly.
And that really was a shock to the system to run headlong into the realization that people I thought were in a shared endeavor of journalism as a tool to expose the truth and injustice wherever it may lay at all costs, were in fact operating on a totally different set of understandings and motivations.
Yes. Yes, and that's why, actually, this book does fit with your previous assignment, because it does speak to that similar... Because I thought when I read the précis of this, I thought that's a bit odd, because Donald Trump's only been president for 6 months or a year. I forget when I first heard about the book. But, of course, you're describing a malaise that goes back a couple of decades?
Yes, both parties, and very often... an ugly trend in the name of political expedience, denigrating brave men and women who serve the United States as diplomats.
Yeah, so what this is, and correct me if my summary is too amateurish, but you're effectively, if you see a Pompeo or the what's the fellow?
Rex Tillerson.
Yeah, or Rex Tillerson, they're kind of like hoodlums. It's an aggression and a reverence, if you like, for unchecked power that has replaced diplomacy, which you describe as softer power, but incremental change, slowly seeking to influence by steering rather than ordering, by sort of a gentle hand on the tiller rather than hijacking the whole boat. And I hadn't realised, and I still don't, I haven't finished the book yet, but I hadn't realised how profound this culture change has been. Before we talk about that further, when was this book conceived in the context of doing the Weinstein stuff?
So I had started looking at the militarization of foreign policy very early on. It was the subject of my dissertation research at Oxford, which goes on to this day.
Diplomatically put.
Yes. I have not, as is sometimes erroneously reported, dropped out of that program.
The PhDs can be a very long and...
very long process writing a PhD. Road. Give me 5 minutes, guys.
Yeah, absolutely.
Come on. Absolutely. People say finger-waggingly, he dropped out of Oxford, but I didn't.
They're looking for a stumble on the CV. I think that's probably what it is.
But it became apparent to me in a lot of the places that I had traveled and was working, and even more so once I was in Afghanistan and Pakistan with the State Department.
Yes, this is when you were working for Holbrooke.
When I was working for Holbrooke. That there was this shrinking space for negotiators and peacemakers and people with a broader historical perspective that could, as you say, be a steady hand on the tiller and an important countervailing perspective in the room when we make our decisions about whether to barrel headlong into conflict.
Yes.
And there's fundamental attitudinal differences between the military and the intelligence community and the diplomacy side of the equation. And those incentive differences are totally fine. The military is hardwired to focus on tactical success within the immediate theater of war. Measurable success in the short term. And
yes.
So you end up with examples like the ones I describe in War on Peace, where, we drop guns into Afghanistan right after 9/11 and give them to whatever warlord can help rout the Taliban. But just as much as that is a useful skill set and perspective to have, there also needs to be this counterbalance of voices that say, hey, wait a minute, here's the opportunity for a negotiated settlement with these guys that can spare servicemen and women from being in the fray of a fight. Here's how this decision to arm someone might echo over the long term. And very often when you don't have that perspective in the room, what I document here is that it ends up coming back to bite you. You end up being unstrategic.
What was the heyday then of having that perspective in the room? Well, because my knowledge in this field is dwarfed by yours, but I would have thought of Kissinger of being an example of the problem you describe rather than of being a kind of representative of the good old days.
Well, I'm careful when talking about Kissinger, who is, as you know, every former Secretary of State went on the record for this book, and Kissinger is in these pages saying some pretty interesting things. I'm careful when rendering him, as with all of these giant figures that run through these pages, to give a nuanced sense of the pros and the cons. I describe the fact that he is very likely a war criminal, and certainly in the eyes of many that's the case. But also, he's certainly a voice of some insight and historical perspective. And he made an interesting point about the way in which this trend of the evisceration of diplomacy actually is rooted in something much bigger, a cultural shift towards the ahistorical, in his view.
Yes.
He talked about Richard Holbrooke's conflict with the Obama administration, where Holbrooke was trying desperately to raise the lessons of Vietnam and to caution against unbridled military escalation absent the voices of diplomats. And he wasn't heard. And Kissinger, reflecting on this, of course, he knew Richard Holbrooke well, said, in his kind of Bavarian rasp, it is one of the great American myths that you can always try something new. Wow, and I thought that was a tremendous moment of insight, that we have with each new administration very often. People coming in fixated on innovation, and I think part and parcel with the dismissal of expertise that we're seeing under the Trump administration and during its, burning down of the State Department is also this broader dismissal of history and context.
So in that reading, Trump's election becomes less shocking, does it or not?
Maybe, right. We as an electorate decided that we'd had enough of the establishment voices and the experts, and we're just desperate for change. But, I think that a lot of the characters profiled in War on Peace also give us a different lesson, which is that you don't have to sacrifice one for the other. Someone like Richard Holbrooke was a great example of expertise, but also an outside-the-box maverick who wasn't afraid to reform and burn down old structures and traditions.
Well, he would subscribe to the notion that you don't have to be one or the other. You would clearly subscribe to the notion
I think
you don't
that's
have to
right.
be one or the other. But society on both sides of the Atlantic seems to be lurching towards the binary. Donald Trump would be the patron saint almost of a binary worldview. You're either 100% this or 0%.
And obviously you're seeing that exact set of frustrations lead to parallel political changes here in the UK.
Yes, and the kind of denigration of expertise. This is not a comparative study. Of course.
I think it's acutely relevant to British readers in that the United States posture in these ways I'm describing so affects all of the places where the UK is engaged. But I honestly don't know the answer to this. Is this playing out to any extent in the Foreign Service here? In the Foreign Office?
Well, it's hard to say with Boris Johnson as Foreign Secretary because you hope that he represents very little of what is going on in the department when he's not on television, kind of appearing on Fox and Friends, trying to grab Donald Trump's attention. We've also got the kind of post-Brexit problem with things like foreign aid, which, as you will know, is more often than not, and especially as your mum will know, is more often than not the way of getting into difficult areas. And we now have this nativist howl that the country's still embarked upon, so they think it's wrong to do anything to help other countries.
It's remarkable in the States anyway. It's 1% of the budget. It's a rounding error.
I think it's 0.7 here.
And it's
but it's so controversial,
astonishingly important in terms of exerting influence and gaining access, as you say.
Well, to answer your question, I think that it's just hard to know who the grown-ups are in British politics at the moment. But I think if there are any grown-ups left, they're still aware of the importance of diplomacy. where would you see the pendulum began to swing back? So that's why I raised Kissinger. When would you have considered to be the heyday of diplomatic power?
There's an interesting parallel. I'm also careful not to describe this as a linear trend. Our American support for diplomacy has had ups and downs. There are moments like a sequester several years ago where everyone's budget was hit, including the Pentagon. But there's instructive parallels to be drawn if you look at, for instance, the coverage of the State Department during World War II,
right?
Where and in the years immediately preceding that there were articles that read very much like the coverage of Rex Tillerson in the past year, where people were decrying a State Department that was ill-suited to meet the challenges of the day and was outdated and slow-moving. And it's interesting to look at what we did in response to that, which was we actually really beefed up the State Department and put more resources in and restructured it and built all sorts of new offices that were meant to, meet these, changing facets of the international landscape. And it worked, There was this incredibly fruitful era of diplomatic accomplishment after that, where the so-called wise men, these sort of prominent diplomats of the time, were instrumental to creating NATO and the World Bank and the UN, and really securing a lot of the structures we still rely on. And I think there's a similar inflection point now where reform is needed, but we are not reforming. We are throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Burning it down.
Yeah, we're burning it down.
To fixing it. It's uniquely depressing, obviously, but we're living in an era of uniquely depressing events. When you arrived in Britain to tour the book, to promote the book, if you'd been charged with imagining a news event that could be more suited to your purposes, Donald Trump violating the Iranian nuclear deal would presumably have been a fairly good contender.
I'm sad to say that the news cycle has been overly kind to the timeliness of War on Peace, between the back-to-back revelations that there was undercover work being done by Black Cube to dismantle and smear the Iran deal and the people behind it.
Again, for people who don't know, this actually involved the wife of a major advisor to Obama, who's
these
put the joint
Israeli private spies were using false identities and front companies to reach out to the wives of prominent architects and proponents of the Iran deal, and calling every possible reporter they'd ever talked to and trying to ferret out anything that could be weaponized against them.
Well, in one case, pretending that they wanted to get involved in fundraising at the children's
at a random school. Yeah.
But I have to meet with you. I can't meet with any of the other fundraisers. That's when the alarm went off, in a way.
And these were very, this was often involved the same agents that were coming after me and the Weinstein accusers, sometimes the same front companies. So we had that revelation, and then of course we had this, culmination of years of saber rattling going back to Trump on the campaign trail, where he finally did pull out of the Iran deal. And look, regardless of what we ultimately learn about the Trump administration's potential links to that undercover operation, we certainly know that there were plenty of overt operations designed to discredit the Iran deal and find ways out of it. This was a campaign promise and a sincere commitment of Donald Trump.
Why?
I think that there's a lot of wholesale destruction of Obama-era accomplishments.
Just petty vendetta.
I think that a lot of it is petty vendetta. I think that, I assume that there is also some sincere conviction about the inadequacies of the deal, but this goes back to a broader problem that I highlight in War on Peace, that there is this fundamental misunderstanding about what effective diplomacy looks like. Effective diplomacy is about compromise, and it's limited and it's flawed, and even the great modern acts of peacemaking, like Richard Holbrooke in the Balkans, result in deals that, in that case, overly empowered the aggressors in the conflict, doubled down on ethnic divisions in a conflict, imperfect in all sorts of ways. But
so it's the least bad resolution.
It was the least bad resolution, and it spared many, many lives. And I think likewise, I spend a lot of time going into the inside story of the brokering of the Iran deal and all the sweat and the blood and the broken bones. and these high-stakes negotiations around the world. And the architects of that deal, the characters in that story, are the first to say this was, by its design, a limited and imperfect arrangement. It did not seek to address Iran's many activities as a bad actor in the international space. It did not seek to, alleviate
Nor did it claim to.
Right, the kidnappings or the missile tests or any of the human rights abuses. But we weren't looking at the Iran deal we got, or alternatively, a perfect deal that solved all of Iran's problems as a bad actor. We were looking at the deal we got, or nothing except for Iran as a nuclear power in a few months flat, and the tactical challenge of having to strike a country that can move things underground and by that point would have the technical know-how to rebuild rapidly. And, I talked to some of the military guys involved in the determination during the Obama administration that was not a satisfactory tactical option. That basically the position we would have been in, absent the deal, was a few months, Iran breaking out as a nuclear power, us bombing them, then them rebuilding immediately, and us having to bomb them again.
Gosh, yes.
And we have, unfortunately, stepped away from the table, basically violated the deal, driving a wedge between us and our allies, sending a troubling message to North Korea at a time when we want them to believe we stand by our commitments if you come to the table with the United States, and leaving us no alternative. There's no plan B. So this is a devastating development from the perspective of this story I tell in War on Peace, and I spend a lot of time unpacking all the possible ramifications of it.
What do you think the most likely ramification is?
I think we've set ourselves back tremendously with respect to Iran and with respect to North Korea.
And what does Trump get out of it, apart from the Yabu sucks to Obama's legacy?
I think that's a pretty big incentive for him.
You really do?
Yeah. And the great irony is, if there is any deal with North Korea, and we're flying blind there, could a meeting between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump bear fruit? Maybe. Time will tell. We are doing it in exactly the wrong way, which is without the bearing of any expertise. We have dismissed all of the people who have tried for decades to talk to North Korea and know the ways in which they lie and the ways in which they will play you if you go into a meeting with them. We're not allowing these ongoing proceedings to be informed by those voices in any way, and I think that's really troubling, whether we succeed or fail there.
Because he thinks somewhere deep inside it's just like building a casino.
Yeah. Certainly there seems to be this recklessness and this total disregard for that kind of careful guidance.
Is there any possibility that it's actually a little more cyclical than you allow? And that if we look at from the British perspective, I think that joining Gulf War II probably wouldn't have happened if Sierra Leone and Kosovo hadn't delivered such a boost to Tony Blair, hadn't been so successful. I don't want to make it sound too cynical, so that he kind of was on the crest of a militaristic wave, and then that wave crashed against the shore in Iraq, and therefore for Obama and for Cameron, the reluctance to get properly involved in Syria, for example, had more to do with what happened in Libya than it had to do with what was happening in Syria. So I
think it's absolutely cyclical.
Right.
And that's something I confront in this book. You see this trend, and I don't want to overstate it and imply that this is always the case, but on a number of occasions, you see administrations come in, go for the military options first because it's splashier and it's quicker and you want results.
And it's easy to communicate to the public. And newspaper editors like it.
It's easy to communicate in the public. The media reinforces it. You think of like Ted Koppel going in with his hard hat to Iraq. And moreover, internally, and this is something I document in the book, there are systems in place to encourage presidents to listen more to those military voices saying, let's go in. And you see that happening in George W. Bush's administration, where there's the disasters of Iraq. And Colin Powell talks very frankly in this book about, the ways in which we were snowed and the ways in which he and the State Department were marginalized in that first term. You see it in the Obama administration's first term, where Ben Rhodes and Samantha Power and others are very frank and kind of giving a mea culpa in this book and saying, like, yeah, we had to change some stuff in the second term as a result of this. Ben Rhodes says, there was a culture of celebrity generals, and we had to course correct after.
Of course.
And then you do see that same course correction across multiple administrations. So after Iraq, Condoleezza Rice, I think reflecting on those strategic disasters, did make a push for, she said, we need a few good diplomats.
Yes.
And she embarked on those 6-party talks with North Korea, for instance. There was a refocusing on diplomacy in Iraq and beyond. In the Obama administration, you saw those last few years devoted to, I think, a sincere reinvestment in large-scale diplomacy. And that's how you got the Iran deal and the thaw in relations with Cuba and the Paris Climate Change Accord.
And if we could squint a bit and keep Donald Trump out of our line of vision, that would be, as we come to the end of our time together, that would be grounds for cautious optimism for the future, or not?
Explain what you mean by that.
Well, I think Donald Trump gives the lie to any notion of a cyclical process, doesn't he? He's such an aberration. He's such an anomaly.
I'm frank about acknowledging that some of the current moment and the extremity to which this trend has been driven is born of an idiosyncratic president hooked on Twitter and with a unique disregard for expertise.
And truth.
But I also think that this is the ultimate cautionary tale in a string of cautionary tales that I document in this book. And I sincerely hope that whatever comes next in terms of American leadership, there is some understanding that it is a matter of urgency that we pull out of this nosedive.
Finally, Ronan Farrow, you struggled to tell me what you would have answered if I'd asked you at 11 what you wanted to be when you grow up. At the age of 30, what would you describe as your ambitions?
I hope that I can be a small part of making the world and the conversation better. And if that means telling stories that expose injustice and elevate voices that have been silenced for too long, then that's something I would be really proud to continue to have the chance to do.
Ronan Farrow, thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
It really was. Hello, I'm James O'Brien. Thank you for watching this episode of Unfiltered. Not only is there plenty more where that came from, but there's plenty more to come as well. So make sure you subscribe to Unfiltered and put yourself at the front of the queue for all forthcoming interviews.